Marcus Evans was not the type to seek attention. At 17, he stood tall and lean, his deep brown eyes observant yet quiet as he moved through Pine Ridge High. Academically gifted and consistently at the top of his class, Marcus blended into the background, content with his studies and shy about standing out. He preferred to let his work speak for itself, never drawing attention to the fact that he was the nephew of Samuel Evans, the U.S. Attorney General. His family connection was something he kept to himself, never flaunting it. Marcus wanted to succeed on his own merit, not because of his uncle's position. His life in Pine Ridge was peaceful enough. He lived with his aunt, Claire Matthews, after his parents moved overseas for work. The move to Pine Ridge had come with many advantages: better academic opportunities, a safe and quiet neighborhood, and ample space to study. Claire's house was large, allowing Marcus plenty of room to focus on his education, and he was grateful for it. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was one he had made his own. Claire often told him that he was too humble for his own good. "Connections matter, Marcus. Don't let pride stop you from using them," she would say. But Marcus disagreed. "If I get into Princeton, Aunt Claire, I want it to be because I earned it," he would reply, determined not to rely on family connections to carve out his future. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Marcus left the school library after staying late to help his classmate Jason with calculus. Jason had been struggling with the material, but thanks to Marcus's patient tutoring, he finally understood the concept. Jason had looked at Marcus with relief. "Thanks, Marcus. You saved me there." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Helping others came naturally to him, even if he didn't seek out the praise. His mind, however, was preoccupied with his college application essay and the upcoming physics presentation. As he packed his bag and glanced at his watch, it was already 7:45 p.m. He had planned to get home earlier, but Jason had needed his help. Walking out of the library, Marcus zipped up his hoodie, the cool evening air a relief from the stuffy, fluorescent-lit environment. Pine Ridge was an affluent town with manicured lawns and pristine colonial homes lining the streets. But underneath the picturesque facade, tension simmered. Marcus had lived here for 3 years, adjusting to the quiet but somewhat tense atmosphere. His Aunt Claire was kind, but often she would warn him to be cautious around certain people, especially those who didn't know his background. What most people didn't know, and what Marcus never mentioned, was that his uncle, Samuel Evans, was the U.S. Attorney General. Marcus never used his family connection for personal gain. He wanted to prove himself on his own. "One day I want to get into Princeton, not because I'm related to someone important, but because I deserve it," he often said. To him, success came from hard work, not shortcuts. As he walked down Maple Avenue, Marcus checked his phone and smiled when he saw a message from Aunt Claire. "Dinner's in the microwave when you get home. Love you." He quickly typed a reply and continued his walk home. The quickest way was through Oakwood Heights, one of the wealthier neighborhoods in town, and a route Marcus had taken many times without incident. Tonight, however, there was something different in the air. The street seemed quieter than usual, and as he passed a particularly grand house, Marcus noticed a woman standing at the window, her eyes locked on him. Her phone was pressed to her ear. Something about her gaze made him uncomfortable, but he didn't let it show. He kept his pace steady, eyes ahead. What Marcus didn't know was that Catherine Wilson, the woman inside the house, had already called the police. 911, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "There's a suspicious young man walking past my house," Catherine said in a hushed tone, her eyes never leaving Marcus. "He's wearing a hoodie, and I've never seen him in this neighborhood before." The dispatcher sighed, already bored. "Can you describe him?" "He's black, tall, and wearing a dark hoodie," Catherine continued, her voice low, but enough to convey her suspicion. "He's just walking, looking at houses. He doesn't belong here." Minutes later, the call was routed to Lieutenant Jack Jensen, a 16-year veteran of the Pine Ridge Police Department. He was used to calls like this, but something about this one piqued his interest. He looked over at Officer Trevor Ross, his rookie partner, sitting beside him. "Time to show you how we handle people like him in Oakwood Heights," Jensen said with a cold smile as he started the engine. Ross shifted uncomfortably, his idealism clashing with the reality of the job. He had only been on the force for 6 months, But already the job had shaken his beliefs. He had joined to protect and serve, but what he saw in Pine Ridge didn't always align with those ideals. Jensen turned the patrol car onto Maple Avenue, eyes scanning for their target. Dispatch says it's a black male, tall, dark hoodie. That's all we need. Ross looked uneasy. But is that enough to pull someone over? He asked. More than enough, Jensen answered dismissively. Marcus continued walking, unaware of the patrol car that had just turned behind him. His mind was still on the physics presentation and college essays. The flash of red and blue lights broke his thoughts as they reflected off the houses and trees. Confused, Marcus stopped, scanning the area for a reason why the police were stopping him. He hadn't been jaywalking or littering. He hadn't done anything wrong. But before he could process what was happening, the patrol car slowed to a stop beside him. Jensen stepped out of the car with his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Evening," Jensen said, his tone sharp. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Marcus, trying to remain calm, replied, "Just walking home from the library, sir. I live with my aunt on Pine Lane. Got any ID on you?" Marcus nodded slowly, carefully reaching into his back pocket for his wallet. "May I ask what this is about? Did I do something wrong?" Jensen's face hardened, and without warning, he barked, "Hands on the car now." Confused and startled, Marcus froze. The sudden aggression made no sense. He didn't understand why he was being treated this way. Before he could react, Jensen shoved him against the patrol car with force, knocking the breath out of him. When an officer gives an order, Jensen growled, "You follow it." "That's how this works." Marcus tried to explain himself, but Jensen wasn't listening. As he roughly patted Marcus down, the situation began to spiral out of control. Jensen's actions were deliberate, and Marcus couldn't help but feel the terror begin to rise in his chest. The rough shove against the patrol car knocked the air from Marcus's lungs, and for a split second, his body froze. His hands were pressed against the cool metal of the car, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. The weight of Officer Jensen's hand on his back, forcing him against the car, sent a wave of confusion and fear rushing through his body. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why was this happening? "Sir, please," Marcus said, his voice unsteady, but he tried to keep it calm. "I don't understand. What did I do?" Jensen didn't respond immediately, instead continuing to search Marcus's body, his fingers brushing over his pockets, feeling the weight of his textbooks. He moved quickly and efficiently, the kind of motion that only someone with years of experience in this sort of thing could carry out. His eyes never wavered, fixed on Marcus as though he were a threat to be neutralized. "Nothing to hide, huh?" Jensen muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with suspicion. "I'm just walking home, sir," Marcus repeated, his voice louder now, desperation beginning to seep through. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I live just up the street." Jensen didn't respond right away, his hands now moving toward Marcus's bag. As he reached for the zipper, Marcus instinctively tightened his grip on his backpack, but the officer tugged it away without hesitation. "What's in here?" Jensen demanded, shaking the bag aggressively, though it only contained textbooks and a notebook. "I said books, just textbooks," Marcus replied quickly, his palms starting to sweat as his nerves threatened to betray him. He wasn't sure what was happening anymore. He wasn't resisting, he wasn't doing anything wrong. So why was this escalating so fast? As Jensen rifled through the contents of the bag, Marcus's mind raced. He could already feel the weight of the situation shifting, the sudden unfairness of it all sinking in. Just a few minutes ago, he had been on his way home, looking forward to seeing his aunt. Now he was being detained by a police officer who seemed intent on treating him like a criminal without reason. The sudden, sharp ring of his phone broke through the tension, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It was his Uncle Samuel calling, the man who held the highest office in the country's Justice Department. He wasn't sure why, but the thought of talking to his uncle now gave him a shred of hope, a reminder that he was not completely alone. He glanced down at his pocket instinctively, but before he could even react, Jensen's hand shot out and yanked the phone from his pocket. "What's this?" Jensen asked, holding the phone up to his face, examining the incoming call. Marcus's stomach dropped as he saw the Washington, D.C. area code flash across the screen. This was his uncle calling, his connection to a far greater power than Pine Ridge could ever comprehend. His last chance to set things right in an instant. "That's just my uncle, sir," Marcus said quickly, trying to remain composed. "He's calling. Please, I need to talk to him. He's the U.S. Attorney General." Jensen's eyes narrowed as he held the phone in his hand. For a brief moment, he looked at the screen, then back at Marcus, his gaze hardening. Without warning, he dropped the phone onto the pavement, stomping on it with his boot. The sharp crack of glass shattered the stillness of the night, and Marcus's heart sank. "Oops," Jensen said, his voice dripping with mock innocence, as though it were an accident. "Thought it might be a weapon." Marcus stood frozen, staring at the cracked screen, his connection to help now destroyed. His only lifeline, the one thing that could have pulled him out of this nightmare, was gone in an instant. The terror he had been suppressing flooded his chest now, overwhelming him. He wanted to scream, to shout, to fight back, but his body felt like it was made of lead, and his words failed him. A terrible realization hit him all at once. In that moment, he wasn't the nephew of the U.S. Attorney General. He wasn't a teenager trying to get home after studying late. He was just another black kid in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. His uncle's power, his academic achievements, his good intentions, they all meant nothing now. He was nothing more than a target. Jensen turned back to his partner, Officer Ross, who had been standing in the background, his eyes flickering nervously between Marcus and his superior officer. He had been quiet throughout the whole exchange, but now he stepped forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lieutenant, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Ross," Jensen snapped, cutting him off sharply. "This kid's got no business being here. You know the drill." Ross swallowed hard, the words on the tip of his tongue, but he bit them back. He had only been on the force for 6 months, and in that short time, he had already witnessed things that shook his faith in the system he had joined. But there was something else about the way Jensen moved, the power he exuded. Ross had seen what happened to those who questioned him. He wasn't ready to risk his career, his life, not for some teenager who was probably lying through his teeth. Jensen didn't give Ross a second glance as he turned back to Marcus, whose mind was still racing, his thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. The officer's hands moved to Marcus's pockets, patting him down with increasing aggression. "What else you hiding, huh? Drugs? Weapons?" Jensen's voice was low, threatening. He wasn't even pretending to be neutral anymore. Marcus could feel his throat tightening as Jensen's hands moved over him. "No! I told you already! It's just books!" Marcus protested, his voice starting to shake as the fear swelled inside him. But Jensen's face didn't change. Instead, with one quick motion, he pulled something small from Marcus's pocket, a plastic bag filled with a small amount of white powder. Jensen's smirk was almost predatory. "Looks like we've got a dealer, Ross. What do you think?" Marcus's mind exploded with disbelief. "That's not mine. I've never seen that before," he shouted, panic rising in his chest. His hands trembled, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. Ross hesitated, his eyes moving from the bag to Marcus's face. He saw the raw fear there, the pleading. For a split second, Ross's gut told him something wasn't right, but he didn't speak up. Not now. Not yet. Jensen held up the bag, shaking it slowly for Ross to see. "Possession with intent to distribute," he said, his voice heavy with satisfaction. "What do you think, Ross? Book him?" Ross looked at Marcus for just a moment longer, guilt gnawing at him. He had to follow the orders, didn't he? The arrest was unfolding before Marcus's eyes, and everything he had ever believed about his town, about fairness and justice, felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Lieutenant Jensen continued his smug smirk, holding the plastic bag of white powder in the air for Officer Ross to see. Marcus's world had just been turned upside down, and in that moment he realized that nothing was going to save him. Not his quiet reputation, not his family connections, not his good intentions. "Looks like we've got a little dealer on our hands, huh, Ross?" Jensen said, his tone dripping with self-satisfaction. Ross didn't answer. Instead, his eyes flickered between Marcus and the bag in Jensen's hand. His stomach twisted with discomfort, but he said nothing. This wasn't right, not by any means, but Ross had learned the hard way not to speak up. He had been on enough calls to see how things worked in Pine Ridge. Things weren't done by the book here. They were done the way the powers that be wanted them to be done. Officer Jensen wasn't just a police officer, he was a tool of the system that ran Pine Ridge. Behind him stood a long chain of influence, stretching from the police department to the local government, and most importantly, to Randall Stokes, the town's most powerful and wealthy figure. Stokes had reshaped Pine Ridge into a private kingdom, using his wealth to ensure his allies were in power and his enemies were either silenced or neutralized. He controlled the police, the mayor, and the local judges. No one in town could afford to cross him. Marcus, unaware of how deep the corruption ran in the town he had called home, had always kept to himself. He wasn't interested in politics, but now as he stood in the cold light of the street, pressed against a patrol car with false charges mounting against him, he began to understand the system that had been rigged to keep him, and people like him, down. The truth was, Randall Stokes had his hands in everything. Real estate, local businesses, political influence, even the police force. He was the one who ensured that Pine Ridge stayed the way it was, affluent, homogeneous, and overwhelmingly white. Any threat to his control was dealt with swiftly, whether through bribery, intimidation, or manipulation. And for years, the police department had been his enforcers, doing his bidding under the guise of upholding the law. Jensen was a perfect example of that system. He didn't care about justice. He cared about keeping his position and the perks that came with it. His loyalty wasn't to the people he was supposed to protect. It was to the man who paid his salary, the man who ensured that his family had everything they needed to live comfortably. Jensen had climbed through the ranks not by solving crimes, but by knowing which ones to ignore, which ones to manufacture, and how to keep the right people in power. And tonight, it was clear that Marcus was just another pawn in their game. Another black kid who had wandered into the wrong part of town at the wrong time. Another target in a town that wasn't designed for people like him to succeed. Marcus could feel the weight of his own helplessness pressing down on him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to shout at them, to demand that they see him for what he truly was. A hardworking student, a kid who had a future ahead of him. But as he stood there with Jensen's hand on his shoulder, holding him in place like a criminal, Marcus realized that none of that mattered. Not here, not in Pine Ridge. "Get in the car," Jensen said, his voice cold as he shoved Marcus toward the back seat of the patrol car. Ross stayed silent, still standing by, but his eyes didn't meet Marcus's. Ross knew better than to show empathy. He was still new to the force, but in Pine Ridge, officers learned quickly that doing the right thing didn't keep you safe. Keeping your head down, following orders, that was what kept you alive. As Marcus was shoved into the back of the patrol car, he felt a mix of fear and anger bubbling inside him. He had never been in trouble with the law. He had always done the right thing. And yet, here he was, being treated like a criminal, being humiliated for simply existing in a neighborhood that didn't want him there. His mind raced. What would happen to him now? How would he explain this to his Aunt Claire? Would she be able to help him? The ride to the station felt long, the flashing red and blue lights from the patrol car's sirens casting an eerie glow through the dark streets of Pine Ridge. Marcus could see the quiet rows of pristine homes as they passed by. The wealth of Oakwood Heights was stark against the backdrop of his situation. He could almost hear the whispers of the neighborhood, the stares from the people who never bothered to learn his name. The streets of Pine Ridge were empty now, the homes dark and silent as the car rolled through the residential district. Inside the car, Marcus sat still, trying to control his breathing. His chest felt tight, and his mind kept racing through a dozen different thoughts. What was going to happen to him? How would this affect his future? Would he be able to prove his innocence? He knew that his uncle, Samuel Evans, was powerful. He knew that if anyone could fix this, it was his uncle. But the thought of having to rely on his family's influence was bitter. He had always tried to avoid it. He wanted to be able to handle things on his own. But now, faced with the reality of what was happening to him, Marcus realized that his silence, his attempts to avoid his uncle's shadow, might have just cost him everything. At the police station, Marcus was taken through the back entrance. The officers didn't give him a chance to make a phone call or contact anyone. His personal belongings were confiscated, and he was led to a holding cell, a small room that smelled of bleach and sweat. The hard metal bench in the corner was cold, and the walls seemed to close in on him. As Marcus sat there, trying to collect his thoughts, he couldn't help but wonder how it had all come to this. He had done everything right. He had worked hard in school. He had helped his friends. He had never broken any laws. Yet here he was, locked in a holding cell, accused of something he didn't do. The door to the cell clanged open, and Marcus looked up, startled. An older man stood in the doorway, his face etched with experience. His clothes were worn, and his eyes held a weight of understanding that Marcus couldn't quite place. "First time in the system, huh?" the man asked, his voice rough. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I shouldn't be here. Those drugs aren't mine. They planted them on me." The older man nodded slowly, stepping into the cell. "You're in Westridge now, kid," he said, his voice gravelly. "If Jensen's involved, you're in for a rough ride." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea who this man was, but his words were enough to make his stomach turn. He wasn't just up against one corrupt officer, he was up against an entire system that was stacked against him. And unless something changed, it seemed like there was no way out. Marcus sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, his back pressed against the metal bench. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting an eerie glow that matched the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. The older man who had spoken to him earlier had disappeared, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He was still trying to process everything, how a simple walk home had turned into a nightmare, how everything he had worked for could be slipping away in an instant. His mind was racing. He hadn't been able to make a phone call, hadn't been able to contact his Aunt Claire. He had no idea what was happening outside the walls of the cell. What did the police tell her? How long would it take for someone to realize he was missing? Meanwhile, outside the police station, the world was beginning to take notice. The video of Marcus's arrest, filmed by a local activist named Linda Gates, had quickly gone viral. It wasn't just any arrest. It was an example of police brutality in an affluent neighborhood, a blatant act of racism and injustice that no one could ignore. The footage spread across social media platforms within hours, igniting outrage among viewers who saw what had happened to Marcus as just another example of systemic oppression that far too many people of color experience daily. Linda Gates, a passionate community organizer and longtime advocate for social justice, had witnessed the entire incident from her porch. She hadn't hesitated to pull out her phone and start recording the moment she saw Marcus being shoved against the patrol car. She knew that video could be the key to exposing the truth. "Police brutality in Pine Ridge," Linda's voice narrated over the video. "This is happening right now, May 12th, just after 8 p.m. The video was damning. The footage clearly showed Lieutenant Jensen planting the drugs on Marcus and violently shoving him into the patrol car. Marcus's terrified expression was unmistakable, and it was clear that he wasn't resisting arrest, just trying to understand why he was being detained in the first place. The video cut to black just as Jensen dropped Marcus's phone onto the pavement, destroying his only connection to anyone who could help him. By morning, the video had garnered millions of views and was being shared by activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike. The hashtag #Justice for Marcus Evans began trending, with calls for the immediate release of the young man who had been unjustly detained. The video, along with public outcry, forced the attention of the wider community to Pine Ridge's long-standing issues with its police force, the wealth inequality in Oakwood Heights, and the systemic racism that had long been overlooked. As the video gained traction, federal authorities began to take notice as well. Samuel Evans, Marcus's uncle and the U.S. Attorney General, was watching the unfolding events in Washington, D.C. He had tried calling Marcus that evening after hearing nothing from his nephew, but when the calls went unanswered, a wave of concern began to rise. This wasn't like Marcus at all. He was responsible, always quick to answer, and always diligent. Something was wrong. Samuel picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized in his sleep, the assistant to the Attorney General's office. "I need an update," Samuel said, his voice cold and commanding. "Has anything come across my desk regarding Marcus Evans?" "Sir, we've received some concerning reports about an arrest in Pine Ridge," the assistant replied, sounding hesitant. "A video has gone viral. Police brutality. The young man in the video, that's your nephew, isn't it?" Samuel's mind began to race. This wasn't just an ordinary case. His nephew wasn't just some random teenager in a troubled neighborhood. Marcus was his family, and the attack on him could not go unpunished. The situation in Pine Ridge had escalated beyond a routine police matter. This was personal. "I need to know everything," Samuel said sharply, already reaching for his coat. "I'm heading to Pine Ridge." By the time he arrived, the social media storm was at its peak. People were demanding justice. Activists were organizing protests outside the Pine Ridge police station, and national news outlets were starting to pick up the story. The video had already made its rounds across the country, and the police had no choice but to address the growing public outrage. Back in Pine Ridge, Claire Matthews was beside herself. She had been calling the police station for hours, demanding to speak with someone about Marcus's arrest. But each time she was told the same thing. "No calls allowed right now. He'll have a hearing soon." She had never felt so powerless in her life. Her hands trembled as she dialed her brother-in-law, Samuel Evans. She had never seen him this calm under pressure, but she needed him now more than ever. "Samuel," she said, her voice strained, "they won't let me see him. They're keeping him locked up. What's going on?" Samuel's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable fury underlying his words. "I'm heading there right now, Claire. I'll get him out. They have no idea who they're messing with." As Samuel's plane landed in Pine Ridge, the investigation into the incident began in earnest. FBI agents arrived in town, working alongside local journalists to gather evidence. Linda Gates, who had uploaded the video, was questioned about what she had seen. It was clear that Pine Ridge's police department was in damage control mode, scrambling to cover up the truth. Samuel wasted no time. His first order of business was to meet with local authorities and make it clear that no one in Pine Ridge, not even Randall Stokes, could protect the officers involved. Stokes had his fingers in every political pie in Pine Ridge. He was the town's wealthiest resident, a real estate mogul with a stranglehold on the local government. He had made sure that his interests were protected, and anyone who got in his way was dealt with swiftly. Samuel knew the magnitude of what he was dealing with. This was no longer just about his nephew's wrongful arrest. This was about something much bigger, the entrenched corruption in Pine Ridge, a town that had been run for years by money, power, and fear. And as Samuel's plane touched down on Pine Ridge soil, he vowed to dismantle that system piece by piece. Samuel Evans had barely touched down in Pine Ridge before he was met by a team of FBI agents, each briefed on the gravity of the situation. The video of Marcus's arrest had not only exposed police misconduct, it had ripped open the very fabric of Pine Ridge's corrupt system. But now, with the full weight of the U.S. Attorney General behind him, Samuel was ready to fight back. The arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind it lay years of systemic corruption, orchestrated by none other than Randall Stokes, Pine Ridge's wealthiest and most powerful resident. Samuel was no stranger to power. As the U.S. Attorney General, he had faced down some of the country's most notorious criminals, including drug cartels and organized crime syndicates. But what awaited him in Pine Ridge was a different kind of challenge, one where power was wielded not with violence, but with wealth and influence. It was a town where justice had been for sale to the highest bidder for years, and Samuel wasn't about to let his nephew's case be swept under the rug. His first move was to meet with the lead FBI agent, Cole Matthews, who had been working undercover in Pine Ridge for months. The investigation into Stokes' network had been slow, methodical, and deliberately kept under wraps. But now that Marcus's arrest had put the entire town under a microscope, they could no longer afford to waste time. "Sir," Agent Matthews began as he briefed Samuel in a small office within the Pine Ridge Police Department, "we've been gathering intel on Stokes for months now, but this arrest, this changes everything. The public outcry, the viral video, the protests, this gives us a chance to finally bring him down. We've got eyes inside the department, but we still need more. We need solid evidence." Samuel nodded. He knew the stakes. He had to act quickly before Stokes and his allies could move to silence those who were now willing to speak out. Agent Matthews handed Samuel a file filled with reports, witness statements, and evidence that had been painstakingly gathered over the course of the investigation. The corruption in Pine Ridge was vast, but the agents had managed to gather damning testimony from several officers who had been complicit in Stokes' operations. One such whistleblower was Officer Trevor Ross, a rookie cop who had been deeply unsettled by the corruption he had witnessed within the force. Ross had seen Jensen plant evidence on Marcus, but he had been too afraid to speak out, until now. "We've got a witness," Matthews said, his voice low. "Ross, he's ready to testify. He's seen Jensen plant evidence before. He's been watching Stokes' operation from the inside, and he's got the information we need to take this whole thing down." Samuel's expression grew more serious. "Get him here. We need him to go on record as soon as possible." Minutes later, Officer Ross entered the room, his face a mixture of fear and determination. He was a man on the edge, having spent the last few days wrestling with his conscience. He had known from the moment he stepped into the job that Pine Ridge was different, but the corruption he had seen up close had shaken him to his core. He hadn't joined the force to be a part of a broken system, but now, standing in front of the U.S. Attorney General himself, Ross knew that his decision would define his future. "I don't know if I can ever make up for staying silent all this time," Ross said quietly, his hands trembling slightly. "But I've seen too much. I can't let this continue." Samuel looked him square in the eyes. "You've done the right thing, Officer Ross. You've seen firsthand how they operate. You've got the evidence we need to bring down this entire system." Ross nodded, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. "I've seen Jensen plant drugs on kids before, just to make arrests look good. But Marcus wasn't a criminal. He was just walking home." Samuel placed a hand on Ross's shoulder. "We'll make sure that everyone involved is held accountable. You're not alone in this." Ross's eyes welled up with emotion. "I don't want to end up like them, sir. I don't want to be one of the bad guys." "You won't be," Samuel said, his voice firm. "You're doing the right thing now, and that's what matters." With Ross's testimony, they had the breakthrough they needed. Samuel wasted no time in reaching out to his colleagues in the Department of Justice. They were going to dismantle Randall Stokes' entire network. The FBI had already gathered financial records, witness statements, and surveillance footage that showed the extent of Stokes' influence over the police, the local government, and even the judiciary. Samuel's team was building a case that could finally topple Stokes' empire. Meanwhile, back in Pine Ridge, the protests outside the police station were growing. People from all walks of life were marching for justice, demanding accountability for the wrongful arrest of Marcus Evans. The viral video had sparked something in the community, a desire for change, a hunger for justice that could no longer be ignored. Linda Gates, who had filmed the arrest, had become a local hero. She had been contacted by multiple news outlets, her video helping to propel the story into the national spotlight. Her work was far from over. She had sent the video to several civil rights organizations, and now the pressure was mounting on Pine Ridge's leadership to take action. But Randall Stokes was not one to give up easily. From his penthouse office overlooking Pine Ridge, Stokes was already taking steps to protect himself. He had been following the protests, watching as his carefully constructed empire began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. He had powerful friends, but even he knew that this was different. This wasn't just about a single arrest. It was about a town on the verge of rebellion. He had made his money by controlling people, by bribing officials, by keeping his enemies in check. But now his own position was in jeopardy. Stokes dialed his lawyer, James Barton. "Get my team together," Stokes said, his voice icy. "We need to put a stop to this before it spirals out of control. I won't let them take me down." Back at the police station, the federal agents were working tirelessly to gather more evidence, bringing in additional whistleblowers from within Stokes' network. They had already secured the testimony they needed from Officer Ross, but now they needed more. The truth about the extent of Stokes' corruption had to be exposed. The clock was ticking, and Samuel Evans knew that time was running out. He had promised his nephew that he would get him out of this, and he intended to keep that promise. But the fight had just begun. Pine Ridge had always been a quiet town, hidden behind pristine homes and perfectly manicured lawns. But now it was alive with energy and unrest. The protests outside the police station had only intensified, and the streets were filled with people demanding accountability for the wrongful arrest of Marcus Evans. Social media had turned Pine Ridge into a battleground, with hashtag Justice for Marcus Evans trending across the country. The video of Marcus's arrest had spread like wildfire, sparking outrage in every corner of the nation. Inside the police station, however, things were a little quieter. Too quiet, if you asked the officers who still had the courage to speak out. Lieutenant Jack Jensen, who had led Marcus's arrest, sat in a small, dimly lit room at the back of the station. His mind raced as he thought about the storm brewing outside. The protesters, the video, the growing national pressure. He had tried to play it cool, but the walls were closing in. And it wasn't just the protesters he had to worry about anymore. He had known this day would come. The power, the money, the influence that Randall Stokes had over Pine Ridge. It wasn't something you could ignore for long. Jensen had made his career by protecting Stokes' interests, turning a blind eye to the things that should have been investigated, and keeping his hands clean while Stokes handled the real business. But now, with federal investigators involved, and with Samuel Evans personally stepping into the fray, Jensen felt the weight of his actions like never before. Jensen's phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from Stokes' lawyer, James Barton. "We need to meet. It's time to discuss the next move." Jensen felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had seen this scenario play out before, but never at this level. Stokes' empire was under siege, and if he didn't act quickly, his own position could crumble right alongside it. The power structure Stokes had so carefully constructed over the years was suddenly vulnerable, and Jensen was just one of the many pieces that could be sacrificed. Meanwhile, across town, Samuel Evans was moving swiftly, coordinating with his team to take down Stokes' operation from the inside. The federal agents had gathered enough evidence over the past few days to start making arrests. Officers involved in planting evidence, including Jensen, had been identified, and the web of corruption within the police force was beginning to unravel. But Samuel knew that time was running out. The longer Stokes was free, the more dangerous things would get. Samuel had promised Marcus that he would get him out of this, and he was doing everything in his power to make that happen. But Marcus was more than just a pawn in this game. He was the key to bringing down an entire corrupt system, and Samuel knew it. His nephew had unwittingly become the face of a movement that was bigger than any one person, bigger than even Stokes himself. The next step in the investigation was critical. Samuel knew they had to get a formal statement from Officer Ross, someone who had witnessed firsthand the corruption within the department and the way Stokes controlled everything. Ross had agreed to testify, but now they had to get him into the right position, and that meant making sure he felt protected, something Samuel knew he could provide. At the same time, Randall Stokes was preparing to make his own move. From his penthouse suite, he paced back and forth, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He had always been able to control the situation, to manipulate those around him to do his bidding. But now things were different. His empire was under attack from all sides, and it wasn't just the protesters or the media that he had to worry about. It was the federal government, the very thing he had spent decades carefully avoiding. He had spent the last few days reaching out to his allies, trying to shore up his defenses. There were still plenty of people in high places who owed him favors, but even he knew that the walls were closing in. His police force, once a tool of his power, was now crumbling. Lieutenant Jensen's involvement in Marcus's arrest had drawn the wrong kind of attention, and the weight of his actions was beginning to catch up to him. But Stokes wasn't the type of man to give up without a fight. He would do whatever it took to preserve his empire, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. He picked up the phone and dialed James Barton, his lawyer. "It's time," Stokes said coldly. "Get me a meeting with the chief judge. We need to move fast." Back at the federal office, Samuel had gathered his legal team to discuss their next steps. They had built a solid case against Stokes, but they knew that they couldn't rest on their laurels. They needed to strike while the iron was hot. The public pressure was mounting, the protests were growing stronger, and they couldn't afford to let Stokes slip away, especially with the influence he still held over the local judicial system. "We need to move on Stokes' financials," Samuel said, his voice steady and commanding. "We've got evidence, but we need more. We need to trace every dime, every deal, and every connection he's made. This isn't just about police corruption. This is about an entire criminal network that stretches across the country." His team nodded in agreement. They had already begun combing through Stokes' financial records, uncovering a trail of bribes, kickbacks, and shady real estate deals that spanned decades. But it wasn't enough. They needed the final piece of the puzzle, solid proof of how deeply embedded Stokes was in the political and judicial systems. "Get in touch with the judge in question," Samuel continued. We need to know who's on Stokes' payroll, and I want a full investigation into the local courts. He turned to Agent Matthews, who had been working tirelessly on the case. Matthews, I want you to reach out to the whistleblower. We need Ross's full testimony. If he's willing to speak, we need to make sure we're ready to use it immediately. Matthews nodded. We're on it, sir. In the streets of Pine Ridge, the tension was palpable. The protests were getting larger by the hour, with more people showing up to demand justice for Marcus. The town, once a quiet place of privilege, was now a battleground. And in the middle of it all was Marcus himself, still locked away in a holding cell, unaware of the movement that was growing in his name. But things were changing. People were waking up to the truth about Pine Ridge, about the corruption, the racism, and the power dynamics that had kept them in check for so long. And as the protests grew louder, the eyes of the nation were focused on Pine Ridge. It was no longer just about Marcus Evans. It was about all of them. It was about justice, accountability, and taking down the system that had allowed people like Randall Stokes to flourish. Samuel Evans knew that the fight ahead would be hard, but he had never been one to back down from a challenge. His nephew had been wronged, and he would make sure that the system responsible for that wrong would pay. The situation in Pine Ridge was reaching a boiling point. As the days went on, the protests outside the police station only grew larger. People were marching for justice, chanting Marcus's name, demanding accountability for the wrongful arrest that had sparked it all. What had started as a single video of police brutality had now become a full-fledged movement, with people from all walks of life uniting to challenge the corrupt system that had kept Pine Ridge under the thumb of Randall Stokes for years. Inside the halls of power, however, things were moving at a different pace. Samuel Evans knew that this wasn't just a fight for his nephew's freedom, it was a battle for the future of the town itself. And the more he saw of Stokes' network, the more he realized that Pine Ridge wasn't just a microcosm of corruption, it was a reflection of a much larger issue. Stokes had built his empire on the backs of the most vulnerable. He had used money, influence, and fear to control the town. His network had infiltrated the police force, the local government, and even the judiciary. But Samuel had always believed in the power of the law, and now it was time to use that power to tear down the system that had allowed men like Stokes to thrive. The evidence was mounting. Samuel's team, along with the FBI, had spent the last few days tracing Stokes' financial dealings, uncovering a web of bribery, extortion, and money laundering that stretched far beyond Pine Ridge. They had already secured testimonies from officers like Trevor Ross, who had witnessed firsthand the corruption within the police department. Now they needed to take action. Samuel stood in his office, surrounded by his team. They were on the verge of something big. "We've got one shot at this," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We've got the evidence, we've got the witnesses, and we've got the public backing. But we need to move quickly. Stokes is smart, and he's got resources. If we don't act now, we risk losing everything." Agent Matthews nodded in agreement. "We've already got the judge's financial records. We know about the bribes, the kickbacks. We know that Stokes' influence runs deep, but we need to get him on the record. If we can tie him to the criminal activities, we've got him." The room fell silent as everyone processed the weight of what was at stake. This was no longer just about Marcus. It was about everything Stokes had done to keep his empire intact. This was about holding the powerful accountable, no matter how far their reach extended. Outside, the protests had escalated. The once quiet streets of Pine Ridge were now filled with passionate voices calling for justice. People held up signs, some with pictures of Marcus, others with messages like "End police brutality" and "No justice, no peace." The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. The town was waking up to the reality of the system that had been in place for far too long. Linda Gates, the activist who had filmed Marcus's arrest, stood at the front of the crowd, holding a megaphone. "We're not just fighting for Marcus," she called out, her voice strong and clear. "We're fighting for every person who's been unjustly targeted by a system that was never designed to protect us. We're fighting for accountability, and we're not backing down." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants filling the air. "Justice for Marcus! Justice for Pine Ridge!" Linda knew that this moment was pivotal. The video of Marcus's arrest had lit a fire. but the flames had now spread across the entire town. Pine Ridge was no longer the sleepy, wealthy neighborhood it had once been. The community had been forced to confront the truth of what was happening in their midst, and they were demanding change. Back in the heart of Pine Ridge, Randall Stokes was trying to keep a grip on his crumbling empire. The protests, the investigations, the growing pressure. He could feel it all closing in on him. But Stokes was a master manipulator, and he wasn't about to give up without a fight. His wealth, his power, his connections, they had all been built over years of careful maneuvering, and he wasn't about to let some teenager's arrest bring it all down. Stokes sat in his penthouse suite, his phone pressed to his ear. "I need you to make this go away," he said to the person on the other end. "I don't care how much it costs. We need to stop the feds and we need to stop the protests. This town needs to stay under control." His lawyer, James Barton, was on the other line, his voice low and steady. "We're doing everything we can, Randall. The pressure is mounting, but we're working on a plan. We've already got the judge on our side. We'll keep this under wraps until we can discredit the evidence. You've got the financial connections to shut this down. Don't worry." Stokes slammed his fist on the desk. "It's not enough. I need more. I can't have this snowballing. I've worked too hard for everything I've built. I'm not going down like this." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Get me the mayor, and make sure the police chief stays in line. We need to do whatever it takes to turn the tide in our favor." The next morning, Samuel Evans stood outside the Pine Ridge courthouse, his mind focused and determined. He had been through many battles in his career, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about bringing down one man. It was about changing a system that had been rigged for so long. The courthouse steps were filled with protesters, holding signs and chanting in unison. Samuel's team had already secured a meeting with the judge assigned to Marcus's bail hearing. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about the entire town, the entire system of corruption that had held it together. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Samuel was about to face down the Stokes' legal team, but he had no intention of backing down. This was his fight now, and he wasn't going to let his nephew or anyone else be the victim of a broken system. The courthouse in Pine Ridge was buzzing with anticipation. Outside, the protests raged on, with people demanding justice for Marcus Evans. The chants of "Justice for Marcus" echoed through the streets, a constant reminder of the growing unrest that had swept through the town. Samuel Evans, the U.S. Attorney General, stood at the front of the courthouse, his face a mask of determination. Today was the day he would make his move. Inside, the courtroom was packed with reporters, local activists, and concerned citizens. The walls were lined with cameras, all focused on the man at the center of it all, Marcus Evans. Marcus, who had become the face of a movement, was about to have his day in court. But the battle being fought wasn't just for his freedom, it was a battle for the soul of Pine Ridge. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. Judge Amanda Williams, a no-nonsense figure known for her tough rulings, took her seat at the bench. She had been brought in at the last minute, replacing the judge who had been involved in Stokes' operations. The moment she took the bench, the entire room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in years, there was hope that justice would be served. Samuel stood at the front, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He had spent the last few days reviewing the evidence, preparing his case. The video of Marcus's arrest had gone viral, and with the federal investigation underway, the stakes were higher than ever. But Samuel knew this wasn't just about one teenager. It was about the future of Pine Ridge. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed men like Randall Stokes to flourish for far too long. Samuel's eyes briefly met Marcus's across the courtroom. The young man had been through hell over the past few days, but there was a quiet strength in him now. Marcus wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the town and the justice system. And Samuel wasn't going to let that symbol fall. "Your Honor," Samuel said, his voice calm but filled with authority, "we are here today because my nephew, Marcus Evans, has been wrongfully arrested and unjustly accused. The video evidence clearly shows that the arrest was not only illegal, but a blatant violation of his civil rights. We request the immediate dismissal of the charges against him." The room was silent as Samuel spoke. His words hung in the air, each one carrying the weight of everything that had happened. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this wasn't just about a simple arrest. It was about the corruption that had seeped into every corner of Pine Ridge, from the police department to the local judiciary. On the other side of the room, Randall Stokes' legal team sat in their usual smug silence. James Barton, Stokes' lawyer, stood up and approached the bench, ready to fight back. He had represented Stokes in countless legal battles over the years, but today he knew it wasn't going to be easy. "Your Honor," Barton began, his voice slick with confidence, "the charges against Mr. Evans are not baseless. The arrest was conducted according to protocol, and the evidence we have shows that Mr. Evans was involved in illegal activity. This is a clear case of possession with intent to distribute. We ask that you deny the defendant's request and proceed with the hearing." The room shifted uncomfortably at Barton's words. Everyone in the courtroom knew that the charges against Marcus were fabricated. The video, the witness testimonies, the evidence, it was all pointing in one direction. But the question remained, would the court be willing to stand up to the system that had protected men like Stokes for so long? Judge Williams leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room. She had been following the case closely, and she knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a routine bail hearing. It was a chance to set a precedent, to show that the justice system in Pine Ridge was capable of change. "I will take a brief recess," Judge Williams said, her voice firm. "When we return, we will proceed with the bail hearing and determine whether or not these charges will stand. The court will also consider the motion for dismissal." As the court recessed, the tension in the room was palpable. Samuel stepped back, his mind racing as he thought about the next steps. The protests outside had only grown louder, and he knew that every minute counted. The longer they waited, the more Stokes had time to pull strings, to make moves to protect himself. But Samuel was determined. He wasn't just fighting for Marcus. He was fighting for everyone in Pine Ridge who had suffered under the weight of corruption and inequality. Outside, the protesters had gathered in even greater numbers. They marched down the streets, holding signs and chanting, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. "No justice, no peace," they yelled, demanding accountability for the crimes that had been committed against the people of Pine Ridge. Their presence was a testament to the growing resistance against the system that had kept the town in chains for so long. Linda Gates, who had been at the forefront of the protests from the beginning, stood among the crowd, her eyes fixed on the courthouse. She had never imagined that the video she had filmed of Marcus's arrest would lead to this moment, a moment when everything Pine Ridge had stood for would be questioned. But now she knew that it was no longer just about the video. It was about the future of the town, about the people who had been silenced for so long. Linda had seen firsthand the toll that corruption had taken on her community. She had seen families torn apart by unfair arrests, by a justice system that had no regard for the lives it ruined. And she had seen the fear in Marcus's eyes when he had been arrested. It was the same fear that every person of color in Pine Ridge had felt at some point. The fear of being targeted, of being punished for simply existing in a town that wasn't built for them. But today, that fear was turning into something else. It was turning into a movement that no one, not even Stokes, could ignore. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, their eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for the decision that would either confirm the hope for justice or reveal the continued dominance of the corrupt system that had ruled Pine Ridge for so long. After a tense recess, the judge returned to her seat, her face stern but composed. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Samuel Evans stood, his posture steady as he waited for Judge Williams to speak. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not just for Marcus's future, but for the future of Pine Ridge itself. Judge Williams adjusted her glasses and addressed the room. "I have reviewed all the evidence in this case, including the video footage, witness testimonies, and the motions presented. It is clear that the arrest of Mr. Marcus Evans was not conducted in accordance with proper procedure. The charges against him are based on fabricated evidence. There is no reason for these charges to stand." The words hung in the air, and the courtroom erupted into cheers. Outside, the protesters heard the news and began to chant even louder, their voices filling the streets. Justice for Marcus Evans. Justice for Pine Ridge. But the battle was far from over. As the courtroom continued to stir with excitement, Stokes' legal team, led by James Barton, had already begun making their next move. Stokes's empire wasn't going to crumble so easily. "Your Honor," Barton said, standing up with a sense of urgency, "we request that this ruling be postponed. This is a gross miscarriage of justice, and we will appeal." Judge Williams shook her head. "The decision is final. Marcus Evans is free to go. These charges will be dismissed, and a motion to expunge his record will be filed immediately." As the judge's gavel came down, marking the end of the hearing, Samuel looked over at Marcus, who was now standing, his eyes wide with disbelief. His hands trembled, but there was a flicker of something else in his gaze. Hope. The weight of the last few days, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it seemed to lift from his shoulders in that single moment. Marcus walked over to his uncle, who enveloped him in a tight hug. "You did it, Marcus. You fought back, and you won," Samuel said quietly. "I didn't do it alone," Marcus replied, his voice cracking. "Everyone fought with me. The people. They stood up for what's right." And Marcus was right. The fight had never been just about him. It had been about every person in Pine Ridge who had been unjustly targeted, every individual who had been oppressed under the system that had allowed Stokes to thrive. This moment was the culmination of years of silence and suffering. The people of Pine Ridge had finally found their voice. Outside the courthouse, the celebration was deafening. The protests that had once filled the streets with anger and frustration now turned into jubilant cries of victory. People were hugging, chanting, and waving signs that read, "No more corruption, and this is our town." Linda Gates, who had been at the forefront of the protests from the very beginning, stood at the front of the crowd, a wide grin on her face. She had never imagined that a single act of courage, a video capturing police brutality, could spark such a massive shift. But here they were, on the cusp of change. Linda looked up at Marcus as he walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by his family and supporters. "You did it, Marcus," she called out, her voice carrying over the crowd. Marcus smiled, but his eyes were reflective. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who stood with me, the people who believed in justice. This isn't just my victory, it's our victory." Back at Stokes's penthouse, the mood was far less celebratory. Randall Stokes paced back and forth, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. The legal team had failed him, and now the very foundation of his empire was shaking. The influence he had spent years building was starting to crumble beneath him. His phone buzzed and he picked it up, seeing a message from his lawyer, James Barton. "The judge ruled in favor of the Evans family. The charges against Marcus are dismissed. We've lost this round." Stokes slammed the phone down, his fist hitting the glass table in frustration. He had never been one to lose. He always found a way to stay in control. But now, with the entire town watching, with the federal government on his heels, and with the people rising up against him, Stokes knew that his time was running out. He could feel the walls closing in. The web of corruption that he had spent years weaving was now unraveling, piece by piece. The federal investigation was just getting started, and Stokes was at the center of it all. His money, his power, his influence. None of it mattered now. He had underestimated the people of Pine Ridge, and he had underestimated the strength of a community united in the fight for justice. Later that day, Samuel Evans met with his team at the federal office. The news of Marcus's victory had spread, but Samuel knew that the real battle had only just begun. The case against Stokes was still ongoing, and the evidence that had been gathered was damning. Stokes's network of corruption was extensive, and it would take everything they had to bring him down. "We've won a small battle today," Samuel said to his team, his voice resolute. "But we can't stop here. This town has been under the thumb of corruption for far too long, and it's time we finish what we started. We have to make sure that no one, not even someone as powerful as Stokes, is above the law." Agent Matthews nodded. "We're already moving forward, sir. We've got more whistleblowers coming forward, more evidence coming in. We'll take Stokes down. It's just a matter of time." Samuel looked around at his team, his resolve unshaken. "Good. This is just the beginning." As the sun set over Pine Ridge, the mood had shifted. The streets were still filled with protesters, but now their chants were celebratory. The feeling of justice, true justice, was in the air. People were walking with their heads held higher, knowing that their voices had been heard. Marcus's release was a victory for the people and a victory for the idea that power should never go unchecked. Marcus sat in the living room of his aunt's house that night, surrounded by his family. He still couldn't quite believe what had happened, but he knew one thing for sure: his life and the life of everyone in Pine Ridge would never be the same again. "This is only the beginning," Marcus said, looking at his uncle. "The town needs more than just a victory. It needs a future where justice really means something for everyone." Samuel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "And that future starts now." In the weeks that followed, the people of Pine Ridge continued to fight for justice. The investigation into Stokes and his network of corruption moved forward, and more officials were implicated in his scheme. The police department was restructured, and the people who had been oppressed for so long began to rebuild their community with a newfound sense of unity. Stokes, once the king of Pine Ridge, was arrested and charged with numerous crimes, including bribery, racketeering, and conspiracy. His empire crumbled, and he was sentenced to decades in prison, where he would have plenty of time to reflect on the damage he had caused. But the greatest change came from the people themselves. They had fought back, and they had won. Pine Ridge was no longer a town divided by wealth and power. It was a town where justice had finally found a home, and the people, young and old, black and white, rich and poor, could walk together, side by side, with hope for the future. And Marcus Evans? He had become a symbol of everything that was possible when people refused to stay silent in the face of injustice.